You're listening to Head Voice, bringing you inside the minds of singers and sound creators who are redefining what it means to make music with the voice. I'm Evan.
And I'm Kayla. And this is the second episode in our Raise Your Voice series with WACA, featuring Lisa Forkish and Nina Kasuya. This particular episode focuses on sexual harassment and consent education.
Before we get into the episode, it's obviously a very sensitive topic to talk about, even though it's in the news right now. It's a very personal issue, and it's a difficult conversation to have. And, you know, I think you'll hear that even in our conversation with Lisa and Nina, that, you know, there's difficult moments in it. And so it's definitely a challenging topic, but we're having this conversation and showing that it's not necessarily an easy thing to talk about, to encourage you to also do the same, because, you know, stuff like this is never easy, but I think you always come out better having had the conversation and getting through those difficult moments. So thank you for coming along with us, and, you know, just wanted to give that preface before we get into it. And without any further ado, I hope you enjoy our conversation with Nina and Lisa.
Hi everyone, we're here with Lisa Forkish and Nina Kasuya, and we're very, very happy to have them on today. This is the second in our WACA series, Raise Your Voice, and this particular episode is going to focus on sexual harassment. Before we get into all of that, we just kind of wanted to turn it over to Nina, because this is your first time on Head Voice, so if you could kind of give us a little introduction about yourself and your music career and your upbringing and whatnot.
Yeah, so my name is Nina Kasuya, and I am based in Los Angeles, California. I am a performer and an educator, and those are my two greatest passions. My two greatest passions are music and social justice, and finding ways to kind of bridge those platforms together. And in that, I have been teaching, which I have found to be one of the greatest platforms to bridge those gaps between those two things, because you get to actually have real conversations with people. And I work with middle schoolers, which is actually probably my favorite age group to work with, which surprises me personally, because I was a tough middle schooler and I would not have been fun to deal with, I'm sure. But it's such a fantastic age to work with, because they are aware of the world, but also not jaded by the whole world. So yes, I am a performer in Los Angeles as well, and I'm performing in several different groups regularly. One of them is Hive, which is an all-female a cappella group that is kind of new and has been a lot of fun. Working with a lot of like-minded women, supporting each other and encouraging each other. And women have been the theme of my music life the past couple years, as I'm also in a cabaret show called Crimes of the Heart Cabaret, which is another group of 5 women, and we do a musical theater cabaret, really focusing on female characters and stories and narratives in musical theater.
Awesome.
Yeah, and the 2 groups that I sing backup for are also fronted by women, and it's a lot of fun. It's something that I never really thought that I would enjoy, because I was the kind of 18-year-old who went into music saying, I don't want to be in an all-girl band because that's too many hormones to deal with. Being intentional about who I work with has become a very big part of myself as a performer and educator as well. And so, yeah, where I'm at is focused on children and women, and bringing everything that I'm passionate about into those spaces.
So Lisa had kind of mentioned this earlier, but you do work in consent education, so we thought it might be helpful to sort of define some words just under the sexual harassment umbrella, just to preface this conversation. So if there's any definitions that you use, or just words to describe certain phrases, that would be helpful for us.
Yeah, consent is the most important word, because I think people think it falls into a gray area, and it doesn't. Right. And my favorite example of explaining what consent looks like in a very clear form is that little YouTube animation with the drinking of the tea. So it plays out a couple different scenarios, but essentially says, if you invite someone over to your house for tea, and you offer them tea and they say yes, and you start making the tea, if any decision from that person gets changed about them wanting to consume that tea, then you can't then force that upon them because that is no longer consensual, right? So if they fell asleep while you were boiling the water and you came back after the tea was ready and they were sleeping, you probably don't want to then shove the tea down their throat and think that they're going to enjoy it because they wanted it before, you know? To me, it's so giggle-worthy because it's very black and white, you know? There is no gray area there. And it's, I think, presented in a way that's very digestible and understandable, no matter who you are and where you fall in your understanding of what consent looked like previously.
Totally. And we will link that video in the description if you're interested. We wanted to have this conversation with WACA in large part because, sexual harassment is in the national conversation right now. With all the celebrities getting outed, and I think it's important to remember that this is an issue that affects all communities. All genders are being affected. So, Lisa, we were also talking earlier about how these are things happening in Hollywood, but it's not really just Hollywood, right? It's forever and through all time. Would you mind speaking to why everything that we see on the news is important to our daily lives and our own communities and lives?
Well, I think it's important to understand that these are just examples in a larger epidemic that is not new to 2017. It's not like 2017 is the year that men started raping women or that men started
Right.
Inappropriately touching women or boys, as is the case as well. And so it's important to understand that these are powerful stories for us to digest because they're people that we admire. For the most part. I mean, some of them may not be, but a lot of them have been actors and comedians and even politicians who are very vocal about their liberal views and their respect for women. Some even were self-proclaimed feminists, and so it can feel harder to digest because it's like, wait, but that doesn't make sense. Louis C.K. is a great example. He's been incorporating stuff about how awful men are to women in his comedy for years, and it's one of the things that I really loved about him. And to understand that there are things at play that are beyond, it's not just, there are people that are just pedophiles, or there are people that are just rapists, or people that just can't keep their hands off of women's asses. There's power structures in play. I think that's a big thing that's important to talk about, is how often abuse of power is really what's going on. It's not about sex. It's not that it's somebody who's addicted to sex, or they just really wanted to have sex with that one woman and she didn't, so they raped her. Sex is often used as a way to assert power over another. And I think that's more what we're seeing at play here with these celebrities, and especially in the case of Harvey Weinstein. And it's been happening throughout history, all of history.
Yeah. I think talking about power dynamics is really important, because I think in music communities, a cappella or otherwise, I think it's really easy to be like, it's a cappella, the thing where you sing with no instruments with your friends, right? And I think that I think like any other thing in life, being an a cappella group in college, or doing a cappella and working with, and being a student and working with older folks on stuff, it's lots of opportunities that are kind of rife for abuse of power in different ways. And I think the toughest thing about talking about these things in our communities, in our groups, is that it's supposed to be a place of fun, and it's hard to talk about those tough issues with people that it's your family, your friends. So how would you kind of advise going about these conversations in our friend groups, in our a cappella groups, in our communities? you know? I don't know if that's a bad question. I'm kind of just shooting from the hip here.
I don't think it's a bad question. I just don't think that there's like one right answer.
Yeah.
And I think like for me, at least, the most important thing is to come from a place of being on an equal platform, because the power dynamics are such a large part of the issue. And so, you know, in having these, because, you know, having courageous conversations is going to be difficult no matter who you're with, whether they're strangers or people who know you to your core. And I think that, coming at it from a place where you're on an equal playing field and you're willing to listen as much as you're willing to share, you know, and like respecting the boundaries that people have, whether they are boundaries that they're discovering in that moment or boundaries that they have set for themselves previously because of what they have experienced. To me, that's really an important part of the structure of those kinds of conversations.
I think listening is really valuable as well, like understanding the power of truly listening. I think so often in these conversations where people get defensive, maybe they feel that their position is being challenged. To, you know, even if you're feeling a defensiveness, like I'm not that kind of person, or I'm not part of this system of oppression against women, or this system against objectifying women's bodies, or whatever it is, just to pause and really listen to what the other person has to say, and maybe even sleep on it for a night before you respond. We're usually so quick to kind of knee jerk in defensiveness, and those conversations, I know that when I've been somebody sharing something personal about myself and making myself vulnerable, and then the response is just that I'm wrong, or that I was wrong, or I didn't understand the situation fully, I'm so much less likely to speak about it again. And that's what really discourages this kind of open dialogue, is when we can't just let people have their stories. And we don't want to hear the truth. Sometimes it's hard, so we want to react to it. But the other thing is, everybody has their truth, and it could be conflicting. You know what I mean? Like two people in a situation can have their truth, and they are telling different stories. And that's what's really challenging about this. But it's important to hear the stories, and nothing else about that.
I feel like, with, you know, harassment specifically, I think it's really easy to make it not about the actual thing that happened. Like, speaking as a cis dude, it's like, I think a lot of us are inclined to, like, I don't know, play devil's advocate, or be like, but men also get harassed or whatever. And it's like, you might be saying things that have some merit to them, but I think it distracts from the actual thing that needs to be talked about, right? Like, I think people, what I see, I watch a disgusting amount of YouTube videos, and I go in the comments more than I'd like to admit. And like, what I see there a lot is like a lot of people being like, but not all men are bad people. Like, you know, I'm disgusted by this person, but I have no affiliation. But to what you're saying, Lisa, it's like, we're all part of this thing, and we all benefit from it in that way, which is horrible and something that needs to be worked on. But it's like, I don't know, for me personally, I think I started to like understand this when a friend would come over and visit me, and she'd be like, yeah, I was, you know, I'm in a bad place right now because I was just catcalled and harassed like 5 times walking over here. And like, that's never something that I've had to experience. And just because I don't have to like be like, she had this thing, like, what about me is important in this? It's like, I think it's important to center the victims and the people who are being abused, and not to, you know, make it about us, because that's the only way that we can really start to address these systemic issues, I feel like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's like the all lives matter argument, you know? Yes, all lives matter, but the ones that we're dealing with right now, it's not about that. You know, we have to focus on the actual issues, and because certain issues affect certain populations disproportionately.
Yeah, and understanding systems of oppression, it doesn't mean we live in a society where there are dominant groups, and just because you're a member of the dominant group, like when I realized I could speak about white people as a white person in a certain way, it was a really important moment to be like, yeah, I'm a part of this. There's no way I cannot be a part of this, even though I reject the system of white supremacy. I know that I'm a part of it because of the color of my skin. And the same thing would go for, if men really want to be in solidarity with the movement, you have to acknowledge your privilege walking in the world, and you have to acknowledge, even though it's not just women that are affected, and even though hashtag not all men, that you are part of the dominant group in a system of oppression against another group. And that's just a powerful place to sit in and understand, and not in a way where you should sit and feel shame and feel guilt, but hopefully as a point of empowerment to do something about it.
Something that men have been kind of saying is like, I think Matt Damon just made comments about like, isn't there a difference between like raping somebody and like making a comment or whatever? And I feel like we can kind of talk about like why, like that consent metaphor with the T and everything, like you were saying earlier, Lisa, it's like you can plug in anything there, like something as seemingly innocuous as like a passing comment. Obviously it's not the same as raping somebody, but in degrees of should you do it or not, it's all on the same level. I'm not making sense. Do you get what I'm putting down?
Yeah, that in degrees of should you do it or not, the answer is no to all of it.
Yes.
I think understanding the ways, that harassment appears in a lot of different ways. And and sometimes it's manipulation. Sometimes it's really super subtle. And that there's not, it's the same thing. You can liken it back to understanding racism. Just because somebody doesn't use the N-word doesn't mean that they're not racist. Or just because we're no longer publicly lynching black folks doesn't mean that we're not still metaphorically lynching black folks in other ways. And that there are various ways that this stuff plays out, and that none of it is okay. So to be like, oh, well, I didn't rape her, I just, grabbed her by the pussy. So that's okay. That's not real laughter. That's nervous laughter. Chuckle.
So
I know. It's not actually funny in any way. But these are hard conversations. And I think that's why, going back to what you said, Evan, about like, how do we have these conversations in spaces like, for example, your a cappella group, where it's supposed to be about the joy of music and the connection between you and your peers and performing and all this fun, happy stuff. I think to understand that things aren't also so black and white, that we're, as humans, we all experience this kind of stuff. And if you're a human, you are being affected by this in one way or another. And so, whether you know it or not, and some more than others, of course, especially on college campuses where sexual assault and rape it is a more serious epidemic than in other spheres, for sure. To understand that having these kinds of conversations, while difficult, can actually create deeper levels of trust, deeper levels of connection that then goes back in to serve the music. Right. So I think it sort of depends, like, to what level do you want to make music in your a cappella group? And if it really is just for fun, and this just feels like too serious a conversation, sure. But I think we have to be opening ourselves to having these kinds of conversations about the way we exist in the world. And it's painful stuff, and being thoughtful about the way we approach it, like we mentioned earlier. But yeah.
I think the hardest part is sometimes having to take a step back and it's just adding to what Lisa was saying, but sometimes you have to look at where you fall in all of this, not because you chose to be there or because of the actions that you're taking out, but like kind of like the stance that you inherited because of who you are. And I think that using that power is important. And for example, like, you know, when you're looking at something like a racial structure, a white man is inherently going to have a larger voice, no matter what he believes, than a black woman. You know, and so I think that if you are the type of white man who can acknowledge that power structure and then use your voice to speak on behalf or create a platform for those people to speak for themselves, that's where you can kind of flip the script. And I think the same thing can be applied to all of these issues, you know, where if you have the power, if you throw it away, then you're throwing it away for everyone. And as hard as it is to keep fighting, sometimes it's the people who have that power who feel like they have nothing to do about it that need to be pushing further, you know?
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
When I hear stuff like that, or I see things that are consistently questionable from certain people that I don't really like know that well, like my desire, misguided or not, is to be like, can this person be exorcised from this community, you know, in the same way that I, you know, see on the news and stuff like that. But it's just like, that's not, as much privilege as I have, it's not something that I have the power to just do by myself. Yeah. You know?
Totally.
Like, and so is there a healthier response than be like, or a more productive response for me than like, I don't know, it just feels so helpless in that
totally no
stuff like that.
And I feel like that's a very valid feeling because it is so large, it's such a big issue. But I think that looking at like restorative justice is the most important thing, because restorative justice demands accountability for the institutions that are perpetrating these things. It's not just about the individual being shamed for the actions that they have taken. And while personal account, you know, when you think about all of these instances, they're happening on a one-to-one basis most of the time. So yes, personal accountability is important, but it's insufficient. And I was reading a really interesting article on Elle.com, Elle magazine, which like I don't really follow, but they have a writer, Melissa Harris Perry, who has this idea based on Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, where she talks about this idea that if William Shakespeare had a sister, Judith Shakespeare, who was endowed with all of the same gifts and insight and intellect as her brother, would she have left behind the same body of work that William Shakespeare did? And her conclusion is no, because unlike her brother, her talent would never have been nurtured. And so we really need to have a room of our own to be able to flourish and nurture and move forward out of this. And so her idea is that, which I love, and it's the only idea I've heard so far that I'm like, you know what, maybe we should make that happen, which is every time a high-profile man is discovered to have a pattern of harassment or abuse, that company, his company, will have to pay 70 cents on the dollar of that man's annual salary towards a room of her own fund, which then would every year give grants to 4 different women, $1 million grant to 4 different women to be I think given out over 4 years or something like that, for them to then do the work that they believe in. You know what I mean? And so putting your money where your mouth is and supporting women with that. Because that's so much more restorative than being like, you know what, they're going to be cut from the company and that's it. Because that's just covering corporate's ass.
Yeah.
It's not doing anything to reallocate resources towards women or victims or survivors or, you know, however they identify.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part of the work, is to understand that justice isn't just served in these individual cases. I mean, it feels good to see justice served, but it's more of just like a moment of personal, like, oh, okay, great. But then what? There's always the then what. And I think because we're talking about power structures a lot of the time, you know, the more that we are, as Nina said, putting resources into empowering women, the more the scale is going to be more in balance. You know, we gotta like tip the scale a little bit in that way. And I guess, I'd also just say with regard to the stuff going on in the community, you know, I think that there are conversations happening. I can just speak with my WACA executive director hat on, to say that there are a lot of conversations happening right now because of the fact that this has been on everyone's radars, where in the past maybe something happening in our community, because we're not seeing it also in the national news media, we're like, oh, well, that's just some guy in our community doing some nonsense. There's a heightened awareness, which, you know, Black Lives Matter gave us a heightened awareness about racial injustice. And I think the Me Too hashtag is giving us heightened awareness about injustices against women's bodies, and then just sort of just like the larger scale of oppression of women in general. But I think that there are conversations happening amongst the leaders in the a cappella community that are going to be good in the long run, that we're finally talking about how this is a problem within our community. We're not immune to it, just like any community. We can't just say because we're all singers and we're singing in harmony, literally, that everything is just happy and fabulous and perfect all the time. There are women who don't feel safe at a cappella festivals anymore. And I think, that came up on one of your recent podcast episodes. And that's not news as well. And so the more we're talking about it and talking about what we can do, the better. It's not a fix all, but it's something. It's better than nothing.
Also then taking those conversations and turning them into intentional actions, you know, whether that means not hiring the same people who are causing problems, or, you know what I mean? It's more than just having the conversations and being like, that sucks.
Yeah.
You know?
I guess I should clarify that we're not just having a conversation. We're talking about concrete actions that we can do, including consent education for the leaders in a cappella, which I think is a really positive first step.
Yeah. And I also, like, this is not to be negative, but I think it's also important to remember that, you know, as the silence breaks, as Time magazine says, like, you know, the Department of Education is still eliminating protections of Title IX on campuses right now. You know what I mean? So, like, it's not like it's getting better just because we're talking about it, and things are moving forward and backward at the same time, because that's what resistance is. You know, it's not just one direction, it's back and forth. Yeah, and so I think keeping our eyes open while we're keeping our minds open is important.
Yeah. And then just kind of to almost switch the perspective a little bit, but because you both are educators, in what ways do you try to empower not only girls but women to make these changes and sort of address these issues?
For me personally, I work with middle schoolers, so like 11 through 14-year-old students every day, and we do performance. You know, I run an a cappella group, but my primary role at the middle school is to run a musical theater program. And so inherently in singing, dancing, and acting, there's a lot of physical contact that happens. You know, whether it's me like trying to show them what their turnout should look like, or, you know, having them feel my breath and things like that. And I have really come to learn that I need to be intentional about asking consent even in those moments where I'm like, can I touch your leg to fix this? You know, do you feel comfortable placing your hand on my back so you can feel this? Things like that. And making that not a strange concept, because I feel like people think it's weird when you're like, I would never ask a girl if I could kiss her. I would just go in for it. I'm like, well, that's not necessarily consensual, you know? Yeah, and just making it a part of everyday life.
Yeah, I work with middle school and high school students, and we have conversations about the way. Well, this year in particular, I have an all-female identified group, and so we've talked a lot about what they experience in the world as teenage girls. And I mostly try to create a safe space where they have a place where they can talk about their experiences and talk about who they're coming to be. I think that the most the most important thing for adolescents, like this age group that Nina and I work with, is feeling that they have a voice. And and all adolescents really want is to be heard and accepted. And so I think that what we can do as educators is to create a space where they know that they are. And that might sound way easier said than done, but I think because of the way people are taught to teach, it's so often an authoritarian, right and wrong. I'm older than you. I'm the teacher. I know everything. You know nothing. That's the structure. Totally. And that's that same power system in play. And even though I'm a woman, I'm still playing into that. If I'm teaching that way. So my classroom is my students have lots of say in lots of everything that happens. And I think I'm teaching them to think critically by always asking them questions instead of just saying, this is how it's going to be. I say, wait, what do you think you want it to be? And ultimately just trying to create a space where they feel that they can be who they are and that they're valued. Yeah. And that I tell them all the time, I'm like, you all teach me as much as I teach you. You know, this is a back and forth. And I think in all various spheres that we've talked about today, that's a relevant concept, to understand the power of giving voice to others. And especially, I mean, you could even talk about young people as an oppressed group. I mean, we talk about the elderly and young people as, well, not the elder. I was going to say as needing to be schooled, not the elderly, but that we talk down to kids and we talk down to elderly and we think they don't know anything. And young people have a lot of wisdom and a lot of insight and they see through our bullshit. I mean, that's the thing that I think we forget is that you stand up there and you teach your class like a dictator. Like they're not buying into that. They won't. They're smarter than we think, and they have a lot to offer. And they're also just a lot more educated on, at least in this community that I live in, our teenagers are highly educated on what's going on in the world, and they really, really care and they want to make a difference. So.
I mean, because one of the things, I don't know if you have to deal with this, Lisa, but like one of the things that I struggle with is that I work within a school district and the school that I work at has uniforms and dress code. And I think, women are very policed as far as the way they present themselves much more than the male students. And I have found, or I think it's important that I voice my opinions when the administration cracks down on certain things, that in front of my students, I voice my opinions about how I feel about those things if I don't think that they are right. Because we had a free dress day, which, they still have to follow certain guidelines or whatever, but they didn't have to wear their uniforms. And one of my students, who was 12 years old at that point, a 12-year-old female, she wore like a thick strap, like tank top shirt. And the administrator pulled her aside, berated her in front of the whole class, and told her she needed to go to the Lost and Found to get a sweater and cover her shoulders. So then I had to have that conversation with everybody, because I don't think that seeing her shoulders hinders anybody's education, and that's the way it's being presented. Like these young girls, these prepubescent bodies are a distraction to the men on campus, whether it's the adults or the other students. And I think that that's something that we need to have conversations about and understand that when we do police in a certain way, that's what we're perpetrating,
And I think the other thing about the policing girls' bodies that relates back to rape and sexual assault culture is that we're putting it on them. It's their fault, instead of saying, oh, well, maybe it's the teacher's fault if they can't concentrate because one of their students is wearing a tank top, instead of the student's fault who's wearing the tank top. Or if they're a boy, I've heard a lot of stories about classrooms around the country where the argument from the administration is the boys can't focus in class. Well, that needs to be a conversation with the boys. And that's how we train our young men to grow up to not be rapists. Because if we're telling them that it's on the girl and that they can have whatever reaction they want to a woman's body in their face, that's essentially telling them they have the power in that situation. So it's important we start even as young as elementary school, right? Where kids are already starting to pick up on some of those dynamics.
Yeah, that reminds me of what you're saying about this stuff can feel very bleak, but I think that there's a lot of people like you two that like want to help and talk about this stuff. I think it's really important that like music is cool and like notes are good, but I think being a person is more important, and being a happy person that feels, you know, heard and accepted and free to go about their lives, I think is more important than making your chord in tune. You know?
Totally.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, music is about community, right?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. How can you make an authentic connection if you're not authentically connected to the people around you, I suppose.
Yeah, I would just mention that, you know, if there's somebody in the community who's listening and you're thinking, where do I go? You know, that I think both Nina and I can make ourselves available to people that
absolutely
have questions or just have a concern or just want to talk to someone. And that's also what WACA is here for, is we're really starting to evolve into more of a resource organization, and really meant to help guide other organizations or a cappella groups or individuals who need support. And we are not experts, but we're here. Our mission is to really serve those that are not being served right now. And we have to be honest with ourselves about the fact that the a cappella community, while small, is predominantly run by cis, white, straight men. And that means that a lot of people perhaps don't feel that they have a voice. And that's what WACA is really hoping to continue to do, is give voice to those that feel voiceless.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think that about wraps up our conversation for today. We're going to link all this information in the show notes down below. If you want to contact Nina or Lisa, we'll have their information below if you need someone to talk to. Thank you both again for joining us. It was a pleasure talking to you, and we hope that you join us.
Thanks for having us.
Of course. We hope that you join us next week for a new episode of Head Voice. Without you.